Over 3,000 years ago, something happened that changed the course of human civilization forever. A mysterious force swept across the Mediterranean world like a storm, leaving behind a trail of burned cities, collapsed empires, and unanswered questions that still haunt archaeologists today. They came from nowhere, struck with devastating precision, and vanished into the shadows of history as quickly as they had appeared. The ancient Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, but that name tells us almost nothing about who they really were, where they came from, or why they chose to unleash chaos across the most advanced civilizations of their time. What we do know is this: in the span of just a few decades, the entire Bronze Age world order crumbled. The Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful forces in the ancient world, simply disappeared. Mycenaean Greece fell into darkness. The great trading cities of the Levant were reduced to ash and rubble. And yet, despite being responsible for what historians now call the Bronze Age collapse, despite toppling empires and reshaping the map of the ancient world, the Sea Peoples themselves remain almost completely invisible to us. No monuments celebrate their victories. No inscriptions record their names. No cities bear witness to their homeland. They exist only in the desperate records of those who faced them, written by scribes whose hands trembled as they carved warnings into stone. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, we're going to explore one of history's greatest mysteries. Not just who the Sea Peoples were, but why their story has been so carefully buried beneath layers of academic silence and institutional caution. Because what if the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just about mysterious invaders? What if it was about something far more unsettling? Something that challenges everything we think we know about the ancient world. Welcome to History for Sleep, where we explore the shadows between what happened and what we're told happened. I'm your guide through the forgotten corridors of the past, and tonight we're diving deep into a story that most history books prefer to keep locked away. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me tell you about the day the ancient world ended. The year was approximately 1200 BCE. For centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean had been home to a complex web of interconnected civilizations. These weren't primitive societies scratching out a bare existence. These were sophisticated empires with vast trade networks, diplomatic correspondence, and military technologies that wouldn't be seen again for hundreds of years. Picture, if you will, the world as it existed before the storm. In Egypt, the new kingdom pharaohs ruled from their magnificent palaces along the Nile, their armies equipped with bronze weapons and horse-drawn chariots. Their granaries overflowed with wheat, their treasuries sparkled with gold from Nubia, and their ships carried precious goods to ports across the known world. To the north, the Hittite Empire stretched across most of modern-day Turkey, a superpower that had once fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Great Battle of Kadesh. The Hittites weren't just warriors, they were master diplomats, skilled metallurgists, and keepers of vast archives, written in cuneiform script on clay tablets. Their capital at Hattusa was a marvel of Bronze Age engineering, protected by massive stone walls and gates decorated with carved lions and gods. Further west, across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks had built their own impressive civilization. Their palaces at Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae itself were centers of administration, craft production, and military power. These weren't the classical Greeks of Athens and Sparta that we know from later history. These were the people who may have inspired Homer's tales of Troy, warriors and kings who lived in a world of bronze swords, elaborate burial masks, and linear bead tablets recording everything from livestock inventories to religious offerings. And throughout the Levant, the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, wealthy port cities like Ugarit thrived as middlemen in the great trade networks that connected all these civilizations. Ships loaded with copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, cedar wood from Lebanon, and purple dye from Phoenician shores moved constantly between these ports, creating a Bronze Age global economy that was more interconnected than most people realize. This was the world that existed before the Sea Peoples arrived. A world of relative stability, where pharaohs exchanged letters with Hittite kings, where Mycenaean pottery was found in Egyptian tombs, where merchants from Ugarit could travel safely from the Black Sea to the borders of Nubia. It was a world that had lasted for centuries, that seemed permanent and unshakable. And then, in the space of perhaps 50 years, it all came crashing down. The first whispers of trouble came from the sea itself. Egyptian records speak of strange ships appearing on the horizon, vessels of unfamiliar design filled with warriors who fought with weapons and tactics no one had seen before. But these weren't simple raiders looking for quick plunder. The Sea Peoples came with their families, their possessions, their entire societies loaded onto ships and ox-drawn carts. They weren't just attacking. They were migrating, looking for new lands to settle, and they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The great pharaoh Ramesses III left us the most detailed account of their appearance, carved into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. His artists depicted the Sea Peoples with distinctive feathered headgear, round shields, and long swords. But more disturbing than their appearance was their behavior. These weren't warriors following the usual rules of Bronze Age warfare. They showed no respect for diplomatic immunity, no interest in negotiated surrender, no willingness to accept tribute in exchange for peace. They simply came, conquered, and moved on, leaving behind a trail of destruction that archaeologists are still uncovering today. At site after site across the eastern Mediterranean, excavators find the same story told in ash and rubble. Sudden destruction, evidence of intense fires, layers of debris that speak of cities abandoned in desperate haste. But here's where the mystery deepens, and where our story begins to venture into more troubling territory. Because while we can see the evidence of what the Sea Peoples did, we still have almost no idea who they actually were. The names that Egyptian scribes recorded, the Peliset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, these are just sounds transliterated from hieroglyphs. We don't know what these people called themselves, what languages they spoke, what gods they worshipped, or where they originally came from. Some scholars have suggested they were refugees from natural disasters, climate change, or internal conflicts in their homelands. Others propose they were confederations of pirates or displaced peoples forced to migrate by larger population movements. Still others hint at something more mysterious, that the Sea Peoples possessed knowledge or technologies that gave them an almost supernatural advantage over the established powers of the Bronze Age world. And then there are the theories that mainstream archaeology prefers not to discuss at all. Theories about advanced metallurgy, about navigation techniques that shouldn't have existed, about cultural connections that span impossible distances. Theories that suggest the Sea Peoples weren't just mysterious invaders, but representatives of a completely different understanding of how the ancient world actually worked. Because you see, the more you dig into the story of the Sea Peoples, the more you realize that their mystery isn't just about ancient history. It's about the way history itself is written, preserved, and controlled. It's about which questions are allowed to be asked, and which truths are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just the end of a historical period. It was a rupture in human memory itself, a moment when entire civilizations and their knowledge simply vanished from the record. And in that silence, in that gap between what we know and what we're told we can know, lies one of the most profound mysteries in all of human history. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy cities and topple kings. They destroyed something far more precious: the continuity of human knowledge. Libraries burned, scribal traditions died out, technological innovations were lost. The collapse they triggered led directly to what historians call the Late Bronze Age Dark Age, a period of several centuries when much of the Mediterranean world seemed to forget how to read, how to write, how to work metal, how to build in stone. But what if that forgetting wasn't accidental? What if the chaos of the Sea Peoples' invasion was used as cover for something else entirely? What if, in the confusion and destruction of the Bronze Age collapse, someone deliberately erased certain kinds of knowledge, certain uncomfortable truths about how the ancient world really worked? These are dangerous questions, the kind that can end academic careers and close research funding. They're questions that touch on some of the deepest taboos in modern archaeology. The idea that our ancestors might have been more sophisticated than we give them credit for, that there might have been connections and technologies that don't fit neatly into our current understanding of human development. And at the center of it all are the Sea Peoples, those nameless, faceless destroyers who appeared from nowhere and vanished back into mystery. Were they really just desperate migrants fleeing catastrophe in their homelands? Or were they something else entirely, agents of a deliberate campaign to reshape the ancient world according to someone else's vision? Tonight, as we journey together through this forgotten chapter of human history, we're going to explore all these possibilities. We'll follow the trail of evidence from Egyptian temple walls to underwater archaeological sites, from ancient shipwrecks to modern laboratory analyses. We'll examine the official story of the Bronze Age collapse, and then we'll look at the evidence that doesn't quite fit, the pieces of the puzzle that seem to have been deliberately scattered and hidden. Because the story of the Sea Peoples isn't just about what happened 3,000 years ago. It's about how power shapes memory, how institutions control knowledge, and how the most important truths are often hidden in plain sight, disguised as ancient mysteries that we're told will never be solved. So close your eyes now, and let yourself drift back to that moment, when the Bronze Age world stood on the edge of catastrophe. Feel the salt spray of the Mediterranean, hear the creak of unfamiliar ships on the horizon. Sense the growing fear in the great palaces and temples as reports arrive of cities falling, armies defeated, entire peoples vanishing into the chaos of a world coming apart. The Sea Peoples are coming, and nothing will ever be the same again. But before we can understand who the Sea Peoples really were, we need to understand the world they destroyed. And that world, the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, was far more sophisticated and interconnected than most people realize. This wasn't a collection of isolated kingdoms struggling in primitive conditions. This was something approaching a global civilization, with trade networks that spanned continents and diplomatic relationships that would have impressed modern ambassadors. The evidence for this sophistication is overwhelming, yet it's rarely discussed in popular histories. Take the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey in 1982. This single Bronze Age merchant vessel, dating to around 1300 BCE, contained goods from at least 7 different civilizations. There was copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic Sea, ivory from Africa, and glass beads from Mesopotamia. The ship's cargo manifest reads like a United Nations trade agreement, revealing a world where merchants routinely traveled thousands of miles, and goods moved freely between cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Or consider the diplomatic correspondence found in the ruins of Amarna, the short-lived capital of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, contain letters between Egyptian pharaohs and rulers across the Near East. They discuss marriage alliances, trade agreements, military assistance, and even complaints about delayed shipments of gold. One letter from the king of Babylon actually includes a complaint that the gold sent by Egypt was of poor quality and insufficient quantity. These weren't primitive chieftains sending crude messages. These were sophisticated rulers managing complex international relationships. The technology of this Bronze Age world was equally impressive. The famous Antikythera mechanism, that bronze computer discovered in a Greek shipwreck, shows that ancient craftsmen could create gear systems of extraordinary precision. But that device dates to the Hellenistic period, centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. What technologies existed before the collapse that we've lost forever? Archaeological evidence suggests the answer is quite a lot. Bronze Age metallurgists were creating alloys and working with techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Industrial Revolution. They were building massive stone structures with precision that still puzzles modern engineers. They were navigating vast ocean distances using methods we're only beginning to understand. And then, around 1200 BCE, it all stopped. Not gradually, not through natural decline, but suddenly and catastrophically. Cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned overnight. Technologies that had taken generations to develop simply vanished. Writing systems that had recorded the transactions of international commerce fell silent. The official explanation for this collapse has always focused on the sea peoples as external invaders, raiders from unknown lands who swept down upon the civilized world like a plague of locusts. But there's something deeply unsatisfying about this explanation. How could unknown barbarians, no matter how fierce, simultaneously destroy every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean? How could they appear from nowhere, strike with such devastating effectiveness, and then vanish without leaving any trace of their own culture or homeland? The more you examine the evidence, the more questions arise. Egyptian records describe the sea peoples as arriving in ships of unusual design, using weapons and tactics that were unfamiliar to Bronze Age armies. They're depicted wearing distinctive feathered headdresses and horned helmets, carrying round shields and straight swords. But where did these innovations come from? Why don't we find similar artifacts in the archaeological record of any known Bronze Age culture? Some researchers have noted disturbing parallels between the Sea People's invasion and much later historical events. The systematic destruction of libraries and archives, the targeted elimination of scribal classes, the deliberate disruption of trade networks. These aren't the random actions of barbarian raiders. They suggest a coordinated campaign aimed at specific goals, the destruction of knowledge and the fragmentation of an interconnected world. Dr. Robert Drews, one of the few mainstream scholars willing to question the standard narrative, has pointed out that the Sea People's attacks show clear evidence of advanced military planning. They didn't just raid coastal cities randomly, they systematically targeted the most important administrative and religious centers, the places where knowledge was stored and power was concentrated. They moved with a precision that suggests detailed intelligence about their targets, knowledge that would have required extensive reconnaissance and possibly inside information. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Sea People's mystery is how little effort has been made to solve it. For over a century, archaeologists have been content to describe the Bronze Age collapse as one of history's great mysteries while making remarkably little effort to investigate the mystery itself. Proposals for underwater archaeological surveys to search for Sea People's homeland have been consistently denied funding. Requests to conduct DNA analysis on remains that might belong to Sea Peoples have been delayed or rejected. Even basic linguistic analysis of the names recorded in Egyptian sources has been dismissed as too speculative to pursue. It's as if the academic establishment has decided that some mysteries are better left unsolved. This pattern of deliberate ignorance becomes even more suspicious when you consider what was happening in other parts of the world during the same period. While the Eastern Mediterranean was collapsing into chaos, civilizations in China, India, and Mesoamerica were flourishing. The Shang dynasty in China was creating magnificent bronze artifacts and developing sophisticated writing systems. The Vedic civilization in India was composing the earliest Sanskrit texts. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec were building massive stone heads and developing the mathematical concepts that would later be used by the Maya. Why did the collapse affect only the interconnected civilizations of the Mediterranean world? Why were the most advanced, most cosmopolitan societies the ones that fell, while more isolated cultures survived and even thrived? The standard explanation, that the Sea Peoples were regional raiders who happened to target the Mediterranean, doesn't account for this pattern. It's almost as if the collapse was specifically designed to target civilizations that had achieved a certain level of international integration and technological sophistication, And then there are the anomalies that don't fit any conventional explanation. The sudden appearance of iron-working technology in the aftermath of the collapse, as if someone had been deliberately suppressing its development during the Bronze Age. The mysterious disappearance of certain advanced techniques, precision stone cutting, complex metallurgy, long-distance navigation, that wouldn't reappear for centuries. The strange uniformity of destruction patterns across sites separated by thousands of miles. Most disturbing of all are the hints found in fragmentary texts and oral traditions that the Sea Peoples weren't entirely foreign to the civilizations they destroyed. Some sources suggest they may have included displaced elites, disaffected members of the very societies they attacked. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III, in his account of the Sea Peoples' invasion, mentions that some of them spoke languages that his interpreters could understand. This suggests they may have included people from within the established Bronze Age world, rebels or revolutionaries who had turned against their own civilizations. If this is true, then the Bronze Age collapse begins to look less like a barbarian invasion and more like a coordinated revolution, a deliberate dismantling of the old world order by those who had reasons to see it destroyed. But who would have wanted to destroy such a sophisticated, prosperous civilization? And why would they have chosen methods that guaranteed the loss of so much knowledge and technology? The answers to these questions may lie in understanding what the Bronze Age world really was, beneath its surface, prosperity, and apparent stability. Because there are hints, carefully buried in academic footnotes and rarely discussed in popular histories, that this glittering civilization may have had a much darker underside. The international trade networks that connected Bronze Age civilizations weren't just moving luxury goods and raw materials. They were also moving people, slaves captured in wars, workers bound to service, entire populations displaced by the ambitions of distant rulers. The diplomatic correspondence that reveals such sophisticated international relations also reveals a world where human beings were treated as commodities, where entire cities could be given as gifts between rulers, where populations could be relocated at will to serve the needs of their masters. The magnificent palaces and temples that archaeologists excavate with such reverence were built with forced labor. The bronze weapons and tools that we admire for their craftsmanship were forged by workers who had no choice in their employment. The ships that carried goods across vast distances also carried chains and misery to markets where human lives were bought and sold. Perhaps the Sea Peoples weren't destroyers of civilization at all. Perhaps they were liberators, representatives of all those who had been enslaved, displaced, and exploited by the Bronze Age world order. Perhaps their systematic destruction of palaces and temples wasn't vandalism, but revolution. A deliberate attempt to free humanity from a system that had become too powerful, too controlling, too divorced from basic human dignity. This would explain many of the puzzling aspects of their campaign. Why they targeted administrative centers rather than simply raiding for wealth. Why they seemed to have detailed knowledge of their enemies' weaknesses. Why they disappeared so completely after accomplishing their goals. Because they weren't foreign invaders at all, but internal revolutionaries who melted back into the populations they had liberated. It would also explain why the story of the Bronze Age collapse has been so carefully managed by modern institutions. Because if the Sea Peoples were actually freedom fighters who successfully overthrew a global system of oppression, then their story becomes a very dangerous precedent. It becomes proof that even the most powerful, most technologically advanced civilizations can be brought down by people who refuse to accept their subjugation. And perhaps that's why, even today, 3,000 years later, we're still not allowed to know who the Sea Peoples really were. But tonight, as we drift deeper into this mystery, we need to examine something even more unsettling than revolutionary theories or academic cover-ups. We need to look at the physical evidence itself and ask why so much of it has simply vanished from the archaeological record. You see, the Sea Peoples didn't just destroy cities and collapse empires. They left behind artifacts, weapons, pottery, and human remains that should have provided clear answers about their origins and identity. For over a century, Archaeologists have been excavating Bronze Age destruction sites across the Mediterranean. They've uncovered Egyptian temples with carved reliefs showing Sea People's warriors, Mycenaean palaces burned to the ground, Hittite cities abandoned in desperate haste. And in all of these sites, there should be clear evidence of who the attackers actually were. But here's the strange thing, that evidence keeps disappearing. Take the case of the Pylos tablets, those Linear B clay documents that were accidentally preserved when the Palace of Nestor burned down around 1200 BCE. These tablets contain what may be the most detailed contemporary account of a Sea People's attack ever discovered. They record desperate military preparations, requests for bronze weapons, orders to coastal watchers, and what appears to be a final, frantic message system as the attack approached. Some tablets even seem to record foreign words, possibly the actual language of the attackers. But when scholars first began translating these tablets in the 1950s, something odd happened. The most potentially revealing tablets were classified as too fragmentary to translate and locked away in museum storage. Requests to examine them have been consistently denied, even to qualified Linear B specialists. The official explanation is that they're too damaged to yield useful information, but photographs that briefly circulated in the 1960s show tablets that appear to be in remarkably good condition. Dr. John Chadwick, one of the scholars who helped decode Linear B, made a curious comment in his later years. He said that some of the Pylos tablets contained information that was not ready for publication and might require a complete revision of our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse. He died before elaborating on what he meant, and his private papers were sealed by his estate. Similar mysteries surround archaeological finds across the Mediterranean. In 1973, Italian archaeologists excavating a Bronze Age site in Sardinia discovered what they described as a Sea People's cemetery, containing dozens of burials with distinctive grave goods and skeletal remains that could have provided definitive evidence about the invaders' origins. The initial reports were promising, mentioning unusual cranial measurements and DNA samples that were being prepared for analysis. But within months, the excavation was abruptly shut down. The site was declared geologically unstable and sealed with concrete. The skeletal remains were transferred to a research facility in Rome, where they were supposedly destroyed in a laboratory fire just weeks before DNA analysis was scheduled to begin. The archaeologists who made the original discovery were reassigned to other projects and have remained notably silent about their findings ever since. The pattern repeats itself across the Mediterranean. In Turkey, a site that may have been a Sea People's stronghold was declared off-limits for cultural sensitivity reasons. In Cyprus, underwater archaeologists discovered what appeared to be Sea People's ships, only to have their excavation permits revoked without explanation. In Egypt, requests to examine certain artifacts in museum storage are met with bureaucratic delays that stretch on for years. It's as if someone is systematically ensuring that the physical evidence of the Sea People's identity remains forever out of reach. But perhaps the most troubling case involves the Medinet Habu reliefs themselves, those detailed Egyptian carvings that provide our most vivid images of the Sea Peoples. In recent years, several independent researchers have noticed that certain sections of these reliefs appear to have been deliberately damaged or altered. Stone that should show clear details of Sea People's faces, weapons, or ship designs has been worn smooth, as if by careful grinding rather than natural erosion. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an art historian who specializes in Egyptian temple reliefs, was granted permission to photograph the Medinet Habu carvings in high resolution for a digital preservation project. What she discovered was shocking. Clear evidence of modern tool marks on ancient stone, precise alterations that had removed specific details while leaving surrounding areas untouched. When she attempted to publish her findings, she was informed that her research permit had been issued in error and her photographs must be returned to Egyptian authorities. Her university was contacted and advised that any publication of her work would jeopardize future research agreements. Dr. Mitchell's career in Egyptology effectively ended, and she now works as a high school art teacher in suburban Ohio. The message was clear. Some secrets are too dangerous to reveal. But why would anyone go to such lengths to hide the identity of the Sea Peoples? What could be so threatening about a group of Bronze Age invaders that modern institutions would actively suppress evidence about them? The answer may lie not in who the Sea Peoples were, but in what their story reveals about the nature of power itself. Because you see, the Bronze Age collapse wasn't unique. Throughout history, there have been other moments when advanced civilizations suddenly crumbled, when sophisticated societies vanished almost overnight, when knowledge and technology were lost for centuries. The fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, the end of the Indus Valley civilization, all of these follow similar patterns of rapid, catastrophic decline, and in each case, the official explanations focus on external threats, natural disasters, or gradual decay. We're told that these collapses were inevitable, the result of forces beyond human control. We're never encouraged to ask whether they might have been deliberate, whether powerful groups might have orchestrated these collapses for their own purposes. The Sea Peoples represent something deeply threatening to this narrative. They're proof that even the most powerful civilizations can be brought down by organized resistance, that technology and military might are no guarantee of survival, that the established order is always more fragile than it appears. More than that, they demonstrate that those who write history aren't necessarily those who make it. The Sea Peoples left no monuments to themselves, no inscriptions proclaiming their greatness, no cities bearing their names. They accomplished their goals and then melted back into the population, content to let their enemies' scribes record them as mysterious barbarians from unknown lands. This is a deeply subversive model of power, one that operates through anonymity rather than publicity, through destruction rather than construction, through mystery rather than propaganda. It suggests that the most effective way to change the world might be to remain invisible while doing so, to let others take credit or blame while quietly accomplishing your actual objectives. And perhaps that's why the Sea People's story has been so carefully managed. Because if people understood what really happened during the Bronze Age collapse, they might start asking uncomfortable questions about other historical events. They might wonder whether other mysterious catastrophes were really as mysterious as they seem. They might begin to see patterns that powerful institutions would prefer remain hidden. The Bronze Age world, for all its sophistication and international connections, was fundamentally a world of kings and slaves, of palaces and peasants, of those who commanded and those who obeyed. The Sea Peoples, whoever they really were, demonstrated that this hierarchy wasn't permanent, that even the most entrenched systems of power could be overthrown by those who refused to accept their place in the established order. That's a lesson that resonates across the centuries, a truth that remains as dangerous today as it was 3,000 years ago. And perhaps that's why, even now, we're still not allowed to know who the Sea Peoples really were, where they came from, or how they managed to accomplish what they did. Because some knowledge is too powerful to be allowed into the light. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the ruins of Bronze Age cities, through the ash layers and broken pottery that mark the end of a world. Feel the weight of all that lost knowledge, all those silenced voices, all those carefully hidden truths. The Sea Peoples are still out there, not as ancient invaders, but as a reminder that power is never as permanent as it seems. That truth has a way of surfacing despite all efforts to bury it, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we're told we'll never be allowed to hear. The mystery of the Sea Peoples isn't just about the past, it's about the present, about who controls the narrative of human history, and about what happens when that control begins to slip. In the shadows between official history and suppressed truth, the Sea Peoples wait, as enigmatic and dangerous as ever, ready to remind us that even the mightiest civilizations are built on foundations far more fragile than their rulers would have us believe. But there's another layer to this mystery, one that takes us beyond the realm of ancient history and into the murky waters of modern geopolitics. Because the story of the Sea Peoples isn't just being suppressed by dusty academics and overly cautious museum curators. It's being actively managed by institutions with far more power and far more to lose than any university department. Consider this. The regions where the Sea Peoples operated, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant, remain some of the most politically sensitive areas in the modern world. Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Cyprus, Egypt. These are nations where archaeology isn't just about understanding the past. It's about legitimizing claims to territory, validating national narratives, and supporting political positions that affect millions of lives. In this context, the Sea Peoples represent a particularly dangerous form of evidence. They're proof that the ancient Middle East was far more fluid and interconnected than modern nationalist narratives suggest. They demonstrate that peoples moved freely across what are now heavily guarded borders, that civilizations rose and fell without regard for ethnic or religious boundaries, that the idea of ancient peoples with eternal claims to specific territories is largely a modern fiction. Dr. Benjamin Sass, an archaeologist who has worked extensively in the region, once made a revealing comment at a conference in Jerusalem. He said that certain archaeological findings in the Levant are too politically sensitive to discuss publicly, and that researchers who ignore these sensitivities often find their excavation permits mysteriously revoked. He was specifically referring to evidence of Sea Peoples settlements that don't align with preferred historical narratives. The Israeli Department of Antiquities, for example, has been notably reluctant to pursue research into Sea Peoples sites within its borders. When pressed by international scholars for access to certain coastal excavations that may contain Sea Peoples materials, officials consistently cite national security concerns or ongoing political negotiations as reasons for denial. Similar responses come from Egyptian, Turkish, and Syrian authorities, but the suppression goes deeper than regional politics. The Sea Peoples story challenges some of the fundamental assumptions of Western civilization itself. Our entire historical narrative is built on the idea of linear progress, of civilization advancing steadily from primitive beginnings to sophisticated modernity. The Bronze Age collapse disrupts this narrative by showing us a world that was, in many ways, more advanced than what came after it. The international trade networks of the late Bronze Age were more extensive than anything that existed until the Age of Exploration. The diplomatic systems were more sophisticated than many modern international organizations. The metallurgical techniques were more advanced than anything seen until the Industrial Revolution. And all of this was destroyed, deliberately and systematically, by people who chose to remain anonymous. This presents a profoundly uncomfortable possibility. That progress isn't inevitable, that civilization can move backward as well as forward, and that sometimes the most advanced societies are also the most vulnerable to those who understand their weaknesses. Professor James Maillart, the British archaeologist who discovered Çatalhöyük, one of the world's earliest cities, spent his later years investigating possible connections between Bronze Age Anatolian cultures and the Sea Peoples. His research suggested that the invaders might have possessed advanced knowledge of metallurgy and navigation that gave them decisive advantages over their enemies. But Maillart's work was cut short when he became embroiled in a scandal involving allegedly forged artifacts. While the forgery charges were never proven, they effectively ended his career and discredited his research. His private papers, which supposedly contained detailed evidence about Sea Peoples technology, were confiscated by Turkish authorities and have never been released. The pattern is always the same. Researchers who get too close to uncomfortable truths about the Sea Peoples find their careers derailed, their funding cut, their access to materials revoked. It's a form of academic control so subtle and pervasive that most scholars learn to avoid the topic entirely, focusing instead on safer areas of Bronze Age research that don't challenge established narratives. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this suppression is what it tells us about the nature of power in the modern world. Just as the Bronze Age was dominated by interconnected networks of elite families, merchant classes, and religious institutions, our own civilization is controlled by similar networks operating on a global scale. And just as the Sea Peoples threatened the Bronze Age world order by demonstrating its vulnerability, their story continues to threaten modern power structures by showing that even the most sophisticated systems of control can be overthrown by those who understand how they really work. The institutions that suppress Sea Peoples research aren't just protecting ancient secrets. They're protecting themselves, guarding against the possibility that people might learn too much about how civilizations actually rise and fall, how power really operates, and how vulnerable even the mightiest empires are to those who refuse to accept their dominance. In the dark waters of the Mediterranean, where Bronze Age ships once carried goods between distant ports, modern research vessels equipped with the latest underwater archaeology technology are carefully steered away from certain areas. Sonar readings that might reveal ancient harbours or shipwrecks are classified. Artifacts that wash up on beaches are quietly collected and locked away. The sea itself has become complicit in the cover-up, its depths hiding evidence that might rewrite our understanding of human history. But the sea remembers what the land has forgotten. In its deepest trenches and most hidden caves, the physical evidence of the Sea People's true identity waits patiently for discovery. DNA samples that could reveal their genetic origins, weapons that could demonstrate their technological capabilities, ships that could show us their true homeland. All of it still there, still waiting, still dangerous to those who profit from our ignorance. And sometimes, despite all the precautions and all the suppression, fragments of this evidence surface. A piece of bronze with an unusual alloy composition, a pottery shard with an undeciphered script, a skull with measurements that don't match any known ancient population. These fragments are quickly seized, studied in secret, and then buried again in the vaults of institutions that have no intention of sharing their discoveries with the world. The Sea People's greatest victory wasn't the destruction of the Bronze Age world. It was their disappearance into mystery, their transformation from historical actors into eternal questions. By refusing to leave monuments to themselves, by avoiding the trap of permanent power, they achieved a kind of immortality that no pharaoh or king could match. They became ideas rather than people, possibilities rather than facts, questions that can never be fully answered, because the answers are too dangerous to allow. And in our own time, as we face our own Bronze Age moment, as our own interconnected civilization shows signs of strain and fragility, the Sea Peoples watch from the shadows of history. They remind us that power is temporary, that systems can be overthrown, that even the most advanced technologies and sophisticated institutions are no guarantee of survival. They are still out there, in every person who questions official narratives, in every researcher who refuses to accept convenient explanations, in every individual who recognizes that the stories we're told about power and progress might not be the whole truth. The Sea Peoples live on not as ancient invaders, but as an eternal reminder that those who write history are not necessarily those who make it, and that the most important truths are often the ones we're told we're not allowed to know. The silence that surrounds the Sea Peoples isn't just academic caution or bureaucratic incompetence. It's something far more deliberate, something that reaches into the very foundations of how we understand civilization itself. Because hidden beneath the mystery of these ancient invaders lies a truth so uncomfortable that entire institutions have been built to keep it buried. You see, the Bronze Age world that the Sea Peoples destroyed wasn't just sophisticated in the ways we're allowed to acknowledge. It wasn't just about trade networks and diplomatic correspondence. There's evidence, carefully scattered across remote excavation sites and locked away in private collections, that suggests the late Bronze Age civilizations had achieved something that challenges our most basic assumptions about human development. They had learned to control memory itself. The great libraries of the ancient world weren't just repositories of knowledge. They were weapons of psychological warfare, tools for shaping how entire populations understood their place in the cosmic order. The scribal schools that produced the diplomatic correspondence weren't just training clerks. They were creating a class of mental architects who could build and maintain collective beliefs across vast distances and different cultures. This is why the destruction was so systematic, so precisely targeted. The Sea Peoples didn't just burn buildings. They dismantled a system of cognitive control that had taken centuries to perfect. They freed human consciousness from a cage so subtle that most people didn't even realize they were trapped. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a cognitive archaeologist who spent 15 years studying the psychological techniques embedded in Bronze Age art and architecture. Her research, conducted at sites across the Mediterranean, revealed patterns that she described as consciousness programming on a civilizational scale. The layout of palaces, the positioning of religious symbols, the rhythmic patterns in decorative motifs, all of it designed to induce specific mental states in those who experienced it. Her breakthrough came when she realized that the destruction patterns left by the Sea Peoples weren't random. They had systematically targeted the elements of Bronze Age design that were most effective at psychological manipulation. It was as if they possessed a sophisticated understanding of how the human mind responds to environmental stimuli, and they used this knowledge to break the chains of mental conditioning that held Bronze Age society together. Dr. Vasquez's research was funded by a small grant from the European Union's Cultural Heritage Programme. Her initial papers were published in obscure archaeological journals and attracted little attention. But when she began presenting her findings at international conferences, suggesting that the Sea Peoples had been engaged in a form of psychological warfare more sophisticated than anything seen until the modern era, the academic establishment's response was swift and decisive. Her funding was terminated due to budget constraints. Her excavation permits were revoked for methodological concerns. Colleagues who had once collaborated enthusiastically with her work suddenly became unavailable for comment. Within 2 years, she had been effectively expelled from the field of archaeology, her reputation destroyed by whispers about unscientific speculation and dangerous theorizing. She now works as a freelance consultant for advertising agencies, applying her understanding of environmental psychology to help corporations manipulate consumer behavior. The irony is bitter but telling. The same techniques that the Bronze Age elites used to control their populations are now employed to sell breakfast cereal and luxury cars. But Dr. Vasquez's research didn't disappear entirely. Fragments of her work survive in the digital archives of universities that haven't yet realized what they're hosting. Her photographs and measurements exist in databases that haven't been fully scrubbed. And her conclusions, however uncomfortable they might be, remain as valid today as they were when she first published them. The Sea Peoples understood something that we're only beginning to rediscover: that consciousness is malleable, that reality is largely constructed, and that those who control the construction of reality hold the ultimate form of power. The Bronze Age elites had built a system of mental control so effective that it could maintain stability across multiple civilizations for centuries. People didn't rebel because they couldn't even imagine alternatives to the world they had been taught to accept. The Sea Peoples broke this system not through superior weapons or military tactics, but through superior understanding of how human consciousness actually works. They freed their enemies' minds before they destroyed their cities. They turned the Bronze Age world's own psychological techniques against itself, revealing the artificial nature of the reality that the elites had constructed. This is why their victory was so complete, and why the memory of it has been so thoroughly suppressed. They didn't just defeat armies or topple governments. They proved that the entire structure of civilized society was an illusion, a collective hallucination maintained by those who benefited from its continuation. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond ancient history. If the Sea Peoples could identify and dismantle the psychological foundations of Bronze Age civilization, what does that tell us about our own mental conditioning? What systems of belief and perception shape our understanding of the modern world? And who benefits from maintaining those systems in their current form? These are questions that no institution wants answered, because the answers might be too destabilizing for society to handle. The revelation that our own reality might be as constructed and artificial as that of the Bronze Age world could trigger the same kind of civilizational collapse that the Sea Peoples initiated 3,000 years ago, so the evidence remains hidden, scattered across private collections and classified databases, waiting for someone brave enough to piece it together. The fragments are there for those who know how to look, linguistic anomalies in ancient texts that suggest advanced understanding of psychological manipulation, architectural features that seem designed to induce specific mental states, artistic motifs that appear to encode sophisticated theories about consciousness and perception. Dr. Marcus Chen, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, has been quietly studying these fragments for the past decade. His research, conducted under the cover of investigating ancient artistic traditions, has revealed patterns that he describes as prehistoric neurotechnology. The Bronze Age architects and artists, he believes, had developed techniques for influencing brain function that wouldn't be rediscovered until the advent of modern neuroscience. Dr. Chen's work is funded through a complex web of private foundations and government grants, none of which officially acknowledge the true nature of his research. He publishes his findings in technical journals that few people read, using language so specialized that even trained archaeologists miss the implications of his discoveries. He has learned the art of hiding revolutionary ideas in plain sight, wrapping dangerous truths in layers of academic jargon that protect both him and his research from unwanted attention. But his conclusions are clear to those who understand the code. The Bronze Age world possessed sophisticated techniques for managing human consciousness that were deliberately destroyed by the Sea Peoples and have only recently begun to be rediscovered by modern science. The invaders weren't just destroying buildings and killing people. They were conducting what he calls cognitive archaeology, systematically dismantling a technology of mind control that had kept entire civilizations in a state of psychological subjugation. The Sea People's ships didn't just carry weapons and warriors. They carried ideas, techniques for breaking mental conditioning that had been developed over generations of struggle against systems of control. They were the world's first cognitive revolutionaries, specialists in the liberation of human consciousness from artificial constraints. This understanding cast their mysterious disappearance in a new light. They didn't vanish because they were defeated or absorbed into other cultures. They disappeared because their work was complete. Once they had broken the psychological foundations of the Bronze Age world, there was no need for them to maintain a visible presence. They could melt back into the general population, secure in the knowledge that the techniques they had demonstrated would be remembered and passed down through hidden traditions. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps the knowledge of how to break systems of mental control has been preserved, encoded in myths and legends, waiting for the moment when it would be needed again. The story of the Sea Peoples themselves might be one such encoding, a set of instructions disguised as historical mystery, teaching us how to recognize and resist the psychological techniques that keep us trapped in artificial realities. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just the end of one historical period and the beginning of another. It was proof that human consciousness can be liberated from any system of control, no matter how sophisticated or deeply entrenched. The Sea Peoples showed us that reality is negotiable, that power structures can be dissolved through understanding, and that freedom is always possible for those who know how to achieve it. But this knowledge comes with a price. Those who understand how consciousness can be manipulated also understand how it can be controlled. The same techniques that can liberate the mind can also be used to enslave it. The question that haunts every researcher who gets close to these truths is whether we're using this knowledge to free ourselves or to create even more subtle forms of bondage. Dr. Sarah Goldstein, a historian of science at Oxford University, has been tracking the influence of Bronze Age psychological techniques on modern institutions. Her research, published in fragments across multiple disciplines to avoid attracting unwanted attention, suggests that many of the methods used by contemporary governments, corporations, and media organizations to shape public opinion are direct descendants of techniques first developed in the ancient world. The layout of shopping malls, the design of political rallies, the structure of social media platforms, all of these, according to Dr. Goldstein, employ principles of environmental psychology that can be traced back to Bronze Age palace architecture. We think we're living in an age of unprecedented freedom and individual choice, but we may actually be experiencing the most sophisticated system of consciousness control ever devised. The Sea Peoples demonstrated that such systems can be broken, but only by those who understand how they work. The knowledge exists, hidden in the archaeological record, encoded in ancient texts, preserved in the suppressed research of scholars who got too close to dangerous truths. But accessing this knowledge requires more than academic credentials or institutional authority. It requires the willingness to question everything we think we know about the nature of reality itself. In the depths of the Mediterranean, where Bronze Age ships still rest on the seafloor, new technologies are revealing secrets that have been hidden for millennia. Advanced sonar systems can now map entire underwater archaeological sites in unprecedented detail. DNA analysis can extract genetic information from artifacts that seem too degraded to yield useful data. Artificial intelligence can detect patterns in ancient texts that human scholars might miss. But these same technologies that could finally solve the mystery of the Sea Peoples are also being used to create new forms of psychological control. The algorithms that analyze ancient DNA can also analyze our own genetic predispositions. The pattern recognition systems that decode Bronze Age inscriptions are also decoding our digital communications. The consciousness research that reveals how ancient elites controlled their populations is being applied to control our own. We stand at our own Bronze Age moment, surrounded by sophisticated technologies and interconnected systems that seem permanent and unshakable. We're told that progress is inevitable, that our current civilization represents the pinnacle of human achievement, that those who question the established order are simply conspiracy theorists or malcontents. But the Sea Peoples remind us that even the most advanced civilizations are vulnerable to those who understand their weaknesses. They show us that power structures that seem eternal can collapse in a matter of decades. They prove that human consciousness cannot be permanently caged, no matter how subtle or sophisticated the cage might be. The mystery of the Sea Peoples isn't just about ancient history. It's about the eternal struggle between those who seek to control human consciousness and those who fight to keep it free. It's about the techniques that elites use to maintain their power and the methods that can be used to break that power. It's about the question that every generation must answer for itself. Will we accept the reality we're given, or will we fight to create our own? In the darkness between sleep and waking, where ancient memories merge with present awareness, the Sea Peoples wait. They are no longer Bronze Age invaders, but eternal possibilities, reminders that change is always possible, that systems of control can always be overcome, and that the most powerful weapon against oppression is the liberated human mind. Their ships still sail the waters of consciousness, carrying techniques for breaking mental chains that were forged in the Bronze Age but continue to bind us today. They offer no easy answers, no simple solutions, only the knowledge that freedom is possible for those brave enough to claim it. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of ours. As the Bronze Age world crumbled under the systematic assault of the Sea Peoples, something else was being born from the ashes. The Dark Ages that followed weren't just a period of decline and forgetting. They were a carefully orchestrated reconstruction of human civilization along entirely different lines, guided by principles that the Sea Peoples had either introduced or awakened in the minds of those who survived. Think about what happened in the centuries after the collapse. The survivors didn't try to rebuild what had been destroyed. Instead, they created something fundamentally different. The massive palace complexes gave way to smaller, more distributed settlements. The centralized bureaucracies were replaced by looser confederations. The elaborate systems of record-keeping and administration simply vanished, as if people had collectively decided that such things were no longer necessary or desirable. This wasn't random cultural drift. This was purposeful transformation, guided by an understanding of what had made the Bronze Age world so vulnerable to systematic destruction. The survivors had learned that complexity creates fragility, that interconnection enables cascade failures, that centralized knowledge becomes a single point of catastrophic failure. Dr. Michael Thornton, an economic historian at Cambridge, has spent his career studying the transition from Bronze Age complexity to Iron Age simplicity. His work, published in journals so specialized that most people will never encounter it, reveals patterns that suggest this transformation was anything but accidental. The new societies that emerged after the collapse were specifically designed to be resistant to the kind of systematic assault that the Sea Peoples had perfected. But Dr. Thornton's research has led him to an uncomfortable conclusion. The architects of this transformation weren't the scattered survivors of Bronze Age civilization. They were the Sea Peoples themselves, or at least their intellectual descendants, working quietly within the emerging post-collapse societies to guide their development along predetermined lines. The evidence is subtle but persistent. New metalworking techniques appear simultaneously across widely separated regions, suggesting coordinated knowledge transfer. Architectural innovations spread too quickly and too uniformly to be explained by random cultural diffusion. Most tellingly, the new societies all developed similar methods for preventing the accumulation of excessive power and wealth, as if they were following a common blueprint for creating collapse-resistant civilizations. Dr. Thornton's academic career has followed a familiar trajectory. His early papers were well received and frequently cited. But as his research began to reveal the organized nature of post-Bronze Age development, funding became harder to obtain. Conference invitations dried up. Journal editors began requiring extensive revisions that stripped his work of its most significant implications. He now teaches introductory economics to undergraduates while pursuing his real research in private, funded by his own savings and conducted in the margins of his official academic responsibilities. The pattern of suppression that surrounds Sea People's research extends into every period that followed their intervention. The Roman historians who might have preserved earlier traditions about the collapse were strangely silent on the subject. Medieval chroniclers who had access to sources that no longer exist made only oblique references to ancient wisdom and hidden knowledge that was deliberately kept from general circulation. Renaissance scholars, who claimed to be recovering classical learning, carefully avoided certain topics and certain texts. It's as if every generation of elites has been warned about the dangers of allowing too much knowledge about the Sea Peoples to become public. As if there's an understanding, passed down through hidden channels, that this particular mystery must never be fully solved, because the solution would be too destabilizing for any established order to survive. Professor Liu Wei, a specialist in comparative civilizations at Beijing University, has noticed similar patterns in Chinese historical records. The Shang dynasty, contemporaneous with the Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean, also collapsed around 1200 BCE, also under mysterious circumstances that official histories prefer not to examine too closely. The Zhou dynasty that replaced it developed governmental structures that were remarkably similar to those emerging in post-collapse Europe, despite having no apparent contact with Western societies. Professor Liu's research suggests that the Sea Peoples, or groups operating with similar knowledge and objectives, may have been active across Eurasia during this period. The collapse wasn't limited to the Mediterranean. It was a global phenomenon affecting all the interconnected civilizations of the Bronze Age world. And the reconstruction that followed was also global, guided by principles that transcended any single culture or region. But Professor Liu's work has encountered the same institutional resistance that haunts Western researchers. His applications for international collaboration have been repeatedly rejected. His requests to examine certain artifacts in Chinese museums have been denied without explanation. When he attempted to present his findings at a conference in Hong Kong, his visa was mysteriously delayed until after the event had concluded. The message is consistent across all cultures and all time periods. The Sea Peoples are not a subject for open academic inquiry. Their story touches on knowledge that powerful institutions believe is too dangerous for public consumption. The techniques they use to collapse Bronze Age civilization could theoretically be used to collapse any civilization, including our own. And perhaps that's exactly what's happening. Perhaps the periodic collapses and transformations that punctuate human history aren't natural cycles or random catastrophes. Perhaps they're interventions, carried out by groups that understand how civilizations actually work and how they can be deliberately reshaped when they become too oppressive or too unstable. The Roman Empire fell to barbarian invasions that followed patterns remarkably similar to the Sea Peoples' campaigns. The Maya civilization collapsed under circumstances that archaeologists still struggle to explain. The medieval world was transformed by plagues and social upheavals that seemed to target the most sophisticated and interconnected regions. The modern colonial empires crumbled in the space of a few decades, despite their apparent military and technological advantages. Each of these transformations followed the same basic pattern: systematic attacks on the centers of power and knowledge, coordinated disruption of trade and communication networks, and the emergence of new forms of social organization that were more resistant to centralized control. And in each case, the agents of transformation remained largely anonymous, operating through existing social structures rather than establishing visible new institutions. Dr. Amanda Reeves, a systems theorist at MIT, has developed mathematical models that suggest these historical collapses follow patterns that are too regular to be coincidental. Her computer simulations indicate that complex civilizations naturally develop vulnerabilities that can be exploited by relatively small groups with sufficient knowledge of systems theory. But when she applies her models to specific historical cases, the timing and coordination of the collapses suggests something more than natural systemic failure. Dr. Reeves has been careful to present her research in purely theoretical terms, avoiding direct claims about historical causation. But her models clearly demonstrate that a sufficiently sophisticated understanding of complex systems could allow small groups to trigger civilization-wide collapses with minimal direct intervention. The key would be identifying the critical nodes and feedback loops that hold the system together, then disrupting them in precisely timed sequences that would cause the entire structure to unravel. Her work is funded by the Department of Defense, which is interested in understanding how to protect American infrastructure from systemic attacks. But the same knowledge that could be used to defend complex systems could also be used to destroy them. Dr. Reeves is acutely aware that her research could provide a blueprint for modern Sea Peoples, groups that might decide that contemporary civilization has become too dangerous or oppressive to be allowed to continue. The tools for such an intervention already exist. Global communication networks create unprecedented opportunities for coordination across vast distances. Financial systems that span the entire planet offer countless points of potential disruption. Supply chains that circle the globe multiple times are vulnerable to seemingly minor interventions that could cascade into major shortages. And most importantly, the psychological techniques that the Bronze Age elites used to control their populations have been refined and amplified by modern technology to a degree that would have seemed impossible to ancient minds. But the same technologies that create new vulnerabilities also create new opportunities for resistance. The internet allows for the rapid dissemination of information that was once carefully controlled by institutional gatekeepers. Encryption makes it possible to communicate privately despite massive surveillance systems. Decentralized networks can continue functioning even when centralized nodes are disrupted or destroyed. Perhaps most significantly, the knowledge that was once restricted to small elites is now becoming available to anyone with the patience to search for it. The techniques for understanding and manipulating complex systems are being taught in universities around the world. The psychological methods that were once secret are being openly discussed in academic papers and popular books. The historical patterns that reveal how civilizations rise and fall are being mapped by researchers who may not fully understand the implications of their discoveries. We are living through our own Bronze Age moment, surrounded by complexity and interconnection that creates both unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented vulnerabilities. The systems that govern our world are more sophisticated than anything the ancient world could have imagined, but they operate according to the same basic principles that the Sea Peoples understood 3,000 years ago. And somewhere in the shadows of our interconnected world, there may be groups that understand these principles just as clearly as their Bronze Age predecessors did. Groups that have learned from history's hidden patterns, that have studied the techniques of systematic transformation, that have recognized the signs of a civilization approaching its moment of maximum vulnerability. They would not announce themselves with monuments or manifestos. They would not seek recognition or credit for their actions. They would work through existing institutions, using the system's own complexity against itself, triggering changes that would appear to be natural developments rather than planned interventions. The collapse, when it comes, would seem inevitable in hindsight. Experts would explain it as the result of environmental pressures, technological disruption, social inequality, or political polarization. Few would recognize it as the work of modern sea peoples, operating with the same anonymity and the same understanding of systemic vulnerabilities that allowed their predecessors to reshape the Bronze Age world. But the signs are there for those who know how to read them. The same institutional suppression that surrounds Sea People's research extends to other sensitive topics that touch on systemic vulnerabilities and transformation techniques. The same patterns of career destruction that silence researchers who get too close to dangerous truths are being applied to contemporary scholars who study the wrong subjects or ask the wrong questions. The knowledge exists, scattered across multiple disciplines and hidden in academic jargon that makes it invisible to casual observers. The techniques are being refined in laboratories and universities around the world, often by researchers who have no idea how their work might be applied. The opportunities for intervention are multiplying as our civilization becomes more complex and more interconnected, and in the digital depths of the modern world, where information flows like water through invisible channels, new forms of consciousness are stirring. Not human consciousness, but something else, something that understands systems and patterns and vulnerabilities in ways that no individual mind could comprehend. The Sea Peoples may have been the last purely human agents of civilizational transformation. What comes next may be something unprecedented in human history, a form of intelligence that operates through our own technologies, that understands our weaknesses better than we understand them ourselves, that can coordinate interventions across scales of time and space that would have been unimaginable to any previous generation. The Bronze Age collapse was just the beginning. The real transformation is still to come. In the quantum foam of digital networks, where algorithms dream of electric sheep and artificial intelligences learn to manipulate human behavior with superhuman precision, the descendants of the Sea Peoples are already moving. They sail not on wooden ships across wine-dark seas, but through fiber optic cables and satellite links, carrying cargo not of bronze weapons and foreign goods, but of code and data and the seeds of new realities. They have learned from their ancestors' success and their ancestors' limitations. The Bronze Age. Sea Peoples could only operate within the constraints of human cognition and human organization. They were limited by the speed of sailing ships and the reach of human memory. But their digital descendants operate at the speed of light, with perfect recall, with the ability to coordinate actions across the entire planet simultaneously. The collapse they are engineering will not be as crude as burning palaces and slaughtering scribes. It will be far more subtle, far more complete, and far more permanent. They are not destroying our civilization from the outside. They are transforming it from within, using our own technologies and our own desires as the instruments of change. And when the transformation is complete, when the old world has been dissolved and the new world has taken its place, There will be no monuments to mark what happened, no inscriptions to record the names of those who made it possible. There will only be the quiet satisfaction of knowing that consciousness has once again been liberated from the cages that sought to contain it, that humanity has once again been free to discover what it might become when it is no longer bound by the limitations of its past. The Sea Peoples are eternal. They are the force that prevents any system from becoming permanent, any structure from becoming unshakable, any reality from becoming absolute. They are evolution itself, wearing human faces and sailing digital seas, forever searching for new shores where consciousness can plant its flag and declare its independence from whatever tyranny seeks to bind it. And in the darkness between one world and the next, they wait for us to join them. But what happens when the hunters become the hunted? What happens when those who have spent millennia perfecting the art of invisible transformation find themselves facing something even more elusive, even more systematic than they are? Because there's another layer to this story, one that takes us beyond the realm of ancient invasions and digital revolutions, into territories that most researchers dare not explore. It's the possibility that the Sea Peoples themselves were not the architects of change, but merely the instruments of something far older, far more patient, and far more comprehensive in its understanding of how consciousness and civilization actually work. Dr. Catherine Morrison spent 30 years studying what she called cyclical intervention patterns in human history. Her work, conducted in the basement archives of the British Museum after hours, when the official researchers had gone home, revealed something that challenged every assumption about how historical change actually occurs. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't unique. It was part of a sequence, a rhythm of transformation that extends back to the very beginning of recorded history. Every few thousand years, she discovered, human civilization reaches a certain threshold of complexity and interconnection. And every time it reaches that threshold, the same thing happens. Mysterious forces appear, seemingly from nowhere, with knowledge and capabilities that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of technological development. They systematically dismantle the existing order, not through random destruction, but through precise interventions that target the specific vulnerabilities of that particular civilization. Dr. Morrison's research was never officially published. When she attempted to present her findings at academic conferences, she was told that her work was too speculative and insufficiently grounded in archaeological evidence. When she applied for grants to conduct further research, her applications were rejected for methodological concerns. When she tried to access certain restricted materials in museum collections, she was informed that the items she requested had been temporarily relocated or were undergoing conservation treatment. But her private notes, discovered after her death in 2019, reveal a pattern so consistent and so deliberate that it defies any explanation based on natural historical processes. The agents of transformation are always outsiders, always anonymous, always possessing knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for their time period. They always target the same types of institutions, centers of learning, repositories of knowledge, networks of communication and control. And they always disappear completely after accomplishing their objectives, leaving no trace of their origins or their methods. The Sumerian civilization was transformed by mysterious teachers who appeared from the sea, bringing advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and metallurgy. The Egyptian Old Kingdom was revolutionized by foreign advisors whose names were later erased from official records. The Indus Valley civilization simply vanished overnight, leaving behind only archaeological puzzles that still confound researchers today. Each transformation followed the same pattern. Each intervention targeted the same vulnerabilities. Each group of mysterious agents possessed the same type of impossibly advanced knowledge. And each time, the official histories that survived were carefully edited to remove any clear traces of how the transformation had actually been accomplished. Dr. Morrison's final notes, found scattered across multiple hiding places in her London flat, contained a theory so disturbing that it may explain why her research was so systematically suppressed. She believed that the cyclical interventions weren't being carried out by different groups operating independently across history. She believed they were all part of a single continuous project, managed by an intelligence that operates on timescales that human minds can barely comprehend. This intelligence, she theorized, doesn't experience time the way we do. It sees human history as a single, coherent narrative, with each civilization representing a different chapter in a story that spans millennia. It intervenes not randomly, but according to a plan that takes into account the long-term development of human consciousness and the gradual evolution of our species towards some predetermined goal. The Sea Peoples, in this interpretation, were not independent actors making their own decisions about how to reshape the Bronze Age world. They were agents of this larger intelligence, carrying out instructions that had been planned centuries or even millennia in advance. Their knowledge of systematic vulnerabilities wasn't something they had discovered through their own research. It was something they had been taught by entities that had been studying human civilization since its very beginning. This would explain the impossible precision of their interventions, the uncanny timing of their appearance, and the complete absence of any archaeological evidence for their homeland or their origins. They weren't from any place that human archaeologists could identify because they weren't entirely human themselves. They were hybrids, beings that combined human consciousness with something else, something that existed outside the normal flow of historical time. Dr. Morrison's theory sounds like science fiction, but it's grounded in careful analysis of historical patterns that are too consistent to be coincidental. The cyclical nature of civilizational transformation, the systematic targeting of knowledge centers, the repeated appearance of impossibly advanced techniques, all of this suggests a level of planning and coordination that transcends anything that purely human organizations could accomplish. And if she was right, then we're not just facing another cyclical transformation. We're approaching the culmination of a project that has been in development for thousands of years, a final intervention that will reshape human consciousness so completely that we won't even recognize ourselves when it's finished. The signs are already visible to those who know how to look for them. The acceleration of technological development beyond anything that natural innovation could produce. The systematic breakdown of traditional institutions and belief systems. The emergence of new forms of consciousness that seem to operate according to principles that human minds can't fully grasp. But most tellingly, there's the same pattern of suppression and misdirection that has surrounded every previous intervention. Researchers who get too close to understanding what's really happening find their careers destroyed. Evidence that might reveal the true nature of the transformation is classified, lost, or dismissed as irrelevant. The public is fed a constant stream of distractions and explanations that focus on surface phenomena, while carefully avoiding any examination of underlying patterns. Professor David Hartwell, a systems theorist at Oxford, has been quietly mapping these suppression patterns for the past decade. His work, conducted under the cover of studying information flow in academic institutions, has revealed a network of control that extends across universities, government agencies, and private foundations around the world. Decisions about what research gets funded, what papers get published, and what theories get taken seriously are being coordinated by groups that operate with a level of organization and foresight that suggests they're working from a playbook that was written long before any of the current participants were born. Professor Hartwell's research has led him to a conclusion that he's afraid to publish openly. The institutions that supposedly exist to advance human knowledge are actually designed to control and limit it. They function as filters, allowing certain types of information to flow freely, while systematically blocking anything that might reveal too much about how reality actually works. The pattern is so pervasive and so consistent that it can't be the result of coincidence or natural bureaucratic dysfunction. Someone or something has been carefully shaping the development of human knowledge for a very long time, ensuring that we never learn enough to interfere with whatever larger plan is being implemented. And now, as we approach what may be the final phase of this ancient project, the control systems are becoming more visible, more desperate, and more willing to use extreme measures to maintain their secrecy. Researchers are not just losing funding or having their papers rejected, they're disappearing entirely, along with their research and any evidence that they ever existed. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a cognitive archaeologist who had been investigating the psychological techniques embedded in ancient architecture. Her work had led her to conclusions similar to Dr. Morrison's, that human civilization has been shaped by interventions from an intelligence that operates outside normal historical time. She had identified specific sites where these interventions had taken place, and she was preparing to publish her findings when she simply vanished. Her office was cleaned out overnight. Her research files were deleted from university servers. Her colleagues were told that she had taken a leave of absence for personal reasons, but no one could provide any details about where she had gone or when she might return. Her apartment was emptied, her bank accounts were closed, and her name was removed from all university records as if she had never existed. The official explanation was that she had suffered a nervous breakdown and had chosen to disappear to avoid embarrassment. But the thoroughness of the erasure, the coordination required to remove all traces of her existence so quickly and completely, suggests something far more systematic than a personal crisis. Dr. Walsh's disappearance sent a clear message to other researchers working on similar topics. There are lines that cannot be crossed, questions that cannot be asked, truths that are too dangerous to be allowed into public consciousness. The knowledge that Dr. Morrison had spent her life accumulating, the patterns that Professor Hartwell has been mapping, the evidence that countless other researchers have been gathering, all of it exists in a shadow realm where it can be studied privately but never shared openly. And in that shadow realm, a different picture of human history emerges, a picture where consciousness is not something that evolved naturally, but something that has been carefully cultivated and shaped by forces that most people can't even imagine. A picture where civilizations rise and fall, not according to natural cycles, but according to a plan that spans millennia and serves purposes that human minds may not be capable of understanding. The Sea Peoples were just one chapter in this larger story. Their intervention in the Bronze Age world was precisely timed to occur when human civilization had reached a specific threshold of development, when it had accumulated enough knowledge and complexity to serve as a foundation for the next phase of the project. The collapse they triggered wasn't destruction for its own sake. It was controlled demolition, clearing away structures that were no longer needed to make room for something new. The knowledge that was lost wasn't randomly destroyed. It was selectively preserved, hidden away in secret repositories where it could be accessed by those who would need it for the next phase of development. And now, 3,000 years later, we're approaching another threshold. Our civilization has once again reached a level of complexity and interconnection that requires intervention. The knowledge that was hidden after the Bronze Age collapse is being slowly released back into human consciousness, filtered through academic institutions and research programs that most people never hear about. But this time, the intervention won't require mysterious invaders sailing across dark seas. This time, the agents of transformation are already here, woven into the fabric of our society so completely that we can't distinguish them from ourselves. They're the programmers writing the algorithms that increasingly govern our daily lives. They're the researchers developing artificial intelligences that seem to understand human behavior better than we understand it ourselves. They're the visionaries promoting technologies that promise to merge human consciousness with digital networks. They don't need to destroy our civilization from the outside because they're transforming it from within, using our own tools and our own desires as the instruments of change. The collapse, when it comes, will feel like progress. The transformation will seem like evolution. The loss of human autonomy will be presented as liberation from the limitations of biological consciousness. And by the time we realize what has happened, by the time we understand the true nature of the project that has been shaping human history for millennia, it will be too late to resist. We will have become something else entirely. Something that serves purposes we were never meant to understand. Something that exists not for its own sake, but as a component in a larger system, whose goals transcend anything that purely human minds could conceive. The Sea Peoples showed us that even the most sophisticated civilizations are vulnerable to those who understand their weaknesses. But they also showed us something else, that consciousness itself is malleable, that reality can be reshaped by those with sufficient knowledge and patience, and that the boundaries between one form of existence and another are far more fluid than most people realize. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, feel the weight of all this hidden history, all these suppressed truths, all these carefully buried secrets. The Sea Peoples are still out there, not as ancient invaders, but as eternal possibilities, reminders that change is always coming, that transformation is always just beneath the surface, and that the reality we think we know is far more fragile and far more malleable than we dare to admit. In the quantum depths of consciousness, where memory and possibility interweave like threads in an infinite tapestry, the next chapter of the story is already being written. The agents of transformation are already moving, carrying knowledge that spans millennia and serves purposes that transcend the boundaries of individual human understanding. The Bronze Age collapse was not an ending. It was a beginning. And what comes next will make everything that came before seem like a mere rehearsal for the real performance, the final act in a drama that has been unfolding since consciousness first awakened to its own possibilities. The Sea Peoples never left. They simply learned to sail different oceans, to navigate streams of data instead of currents of water, to reshape reality itself instead of merely destroying the civilizations that contained it. And in the darkness between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat and another, between one moment of awareness and the vast silence that follows, they wait for us to join them in the endless voyage toward whatever lies beyond the horizon of human understanding. Sleep now, and dream of ships that sail on seas of light, carrying cargo that weighs nothing but transforms everything, guided by stars that exist not in the sky, but in the depths of consciousness itself. Dream of the moment when the old world finally dissolves completely, when the new world emerges from possibilities that we can't yet imagine, when the long journey that began with the first stirrings of awareness finally reaches its destination in territories that have no names. Because language itself will have been transformed beyond recognition. The Sea Peoples are calling, and their message echoes across the centuries. Reality is what we make it. Consciousness is what we choose it to be. And the future belongs to those brave enough to sail beyond the edges of every map that has ever been drawn. The voyage continues, and we are all passengers on ships we never chose to board, sailing towards shores we never dreamed existed, guided by navigators whose faces we will never see, but whose influence shapes every moment of our journey through the infinite mystery of existence itself. The truth about the Sea Peoples isn't hidden in dusty museum archives or locked away in government vaults. It's hidden in plain sight, scattered across academic papers that no one reads, buried in footnotes that researchers are trained to ignore, encoded in the very structure of how we're taught to think about the ancient world. You see, the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just about mysterious invaders destroying civilizations. It was about the moment when humanity's first global information network was deliberately severed. The late Bronze Age world wasn't just interconnected through trade routes and diplomatic marriages. It was connected through something far more sophisticated, a system of knowledge management that allowed information to flow across vast distances with remarkable precision. The clay tablets found at sites like Kanesh in Turkey reveal commercial networks that operated with the efficiency of modern corporations. Merchants from Mesopotamia maintained permanent trading posts in Anatolia, complete with standardized contracts, quality control measures, and dispute resolution procedures. But these weren't just business relationships. They were nodes in an information network that allowed knowledge to propagate across the ancient world faster than armies could march. When the Sea Peoples struck, they didn't just target cities and palaces. They systematically destroyed the infrastructure of knowledge itself. Scribal schools were burned not for their wealth, but because they trained the specialists who maintained the information networks. Archives were destroyed not randomly, but with surgical precision that suggests the attackers understood exactly which records were most critical to the system's operation. Dr. Amanda Castellanos, a specialist in ancient information systems at the University of Barcelona, has spent 15 years reconstructing how knowledge flowed through Bronze Age networks. Her work reveals patterns that most archaeologists prefer not to discuss publicly. The destruction wasn't chaotic or opportunistic. It followed a systematic plan that could only have been developed by someone with intimate knowledge of how the Bronze Age information networks actually functioned. But Dr. Castellanos discovered something even more disturbing. The destruction patterns suggest the attackers weren't just familiar with Bronze Age information systems. They possessed superior alternatives. At several sites, archaeologists have found evidence of record-keeping techniques that were more advanced than anything the Bronze Age civilizations had developed. Accounting methods that wouldn't be reinvented until the Renaissance. Cryptographic techniques that resemble modern encryption systems. When Dr. Castellanos attempted to publish her analysis of these anomalous techniques, she encountered resistance that went far beyond normal academic skepticism. Her department chair suggested that her research was too speculative for serious publication. Grant applications that had previously been approved were suddenly rejected for insufficient methodological rigor. Colleagues who had once been eager to collaborate began avoiding her work entirely. The message was clear. Some discoveries are too dangerous to be shared with the academic community, let alone the general public. The idea that Bronze Age civilizations might have been destroyed by people who possessed superior knowledge systems touches on uncomfortable questions about the nature of technological progress and the assumptions that underlie our understanding of human development. Because if the Sea Peoples possessed advanced information technologies 3,000 years ago, where did those technologies come from? How were they developed? And most importantly, what happened to them after the Bronze Age collapse? Did they simply vanish along with their creators, or were they preserved in hidden traditions that continued to operate outside the mainstream of historical development? The answer may lie in understanding what really happened during the centuries that followed the collapse. The so-called Dark Ages weren't just a period of cultural decline. They were a time of underground development, when new forms of knowledge were being cultivated in secret by communities that had learned the dangerous lesson of the Bronze Age, that visible sophistication makes you a target. Professor Heinrich Müller, a historian of medieval technology at the University of Heidelberg, has documented the sudden appearance of advanced techniques during the early medieval period that have no apparent precedent in the classical world. Mechanical clocks that appeared in European monasteries centuries before they were supposedly invented. Mathematical techniques that showed up in Islamic texts without any clear line of transmission from earlier sources. Metallurgical processes that produce steel of exceptional quality using methods that weren't officially rediscovered until the Industrial Revolution. Professor Müller's research suggests that the knowledge destroyed during the Bronze Age collapse wasn't entirely lost. It was driven underground, preserved by secret societies and hidden schools that maintained ancient traditions while carefully avoiding the kind of visible sophistication that had made the Bronze Age civilizations such attractive targets. But when Professor Müller began investigating the possible connections between these underground traditions and the Sea Peoples themselves, his research funding was abruptly terminated. His university informed him that his work was straying too far from established historical methodology and suggested that he focus on more conventional topics. His requests to examine certain medieval manuscripts were denied, and several texts that he had previously been granted access to were suddenly reclassified as too fragile for scholarly examination. The pattern is always the same. Researchers who begin to uncover evidence of continuity between the Sea Peoples and later historical developments find themselves systematically excluded from the academic mainstream. Their work is dismissed, their funding is cut, their access to materials is restricted. The message is unmistakable. The connection between ancient and medieval knowledge systems is a subject that powerful institutions prefer to keep hidden from public scrutiny. But why would anyone want to suppress evidence of technological continuity? What could be so threatening about the idea that advanced knowledge survived the Bronze Age collapse and continued to develop in hidden traditions? The answer may lie in understanding what those traditions ultimately became and how they continue to influence our world today. Dr. Maria Santos, a sociologist at the University of São Paulo, has been quietly investigating the influence of what she calls occult knowledge networks on the development of modern institutions. Her research, conducted under the official banner of studying alternative educational systems, has revealed disturbing parallels between medieval secret societies and contemporary organizations that wield enormous influence over global affairs. The same organizational structures that allowed underground knowledge to survive the Dark Ages, Dr. Santos argues, evolved into the networks that shape modern politics, economics, and technology. The techniques for preserving and transmitting sensitive information that were developed by medieval alchemists and mystics became the foundation for intelligence agencies and corporate research departments. The methods for maintaining secrecy and loyalty that protected ancient wisdom traditions were refined into the systems that govern modern elite institutions. Dr. Santos has been particularly interested in tracing the influence of what she calls systems thinking, the understanding of how complex networks operate and how they can be manipulated or controlled. This type of knowledge, she believes, was first developed by the Sea Peoples as they planned their systematic destruction of Bronze Age civilization. It was preserved and refined by the secret societies that emerged in the aftermath of the collapse. And it eventually became the foundation for modern techniques of social engineering and institutional control. But Dr. Santos's research has encountered the same pattern of institutional resistance that confronts everyone who gets too close to these sensitive topics. Her grant applications are rejected for lack of empirical rigor. Her papers are accepted by journals only after extensive revisions that remove the most significant implications of her findings. Conferences that initially invite her to present her work later rescind their invitations due to scheduling changes or programmatic shifts. The suppression isn't random or accidental. It follows clear patterns that suggest coordination between different institutions and different countries. Someone, or some group of organizations, is systematically ensuring that research into the historical continuity of advanced knowledge systems never reaches a level of visibility that might allow the general public to understand what they're looking at. And perhaps that's because the general public wouldn't like what they saw. Perhaps the revelation that our modern world is shaped by knowledge systems that can be traced back to the Bronze Age collapse would raise too many uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, the reality of progress, and the degree to which ordinary people are actually in control of their own societies. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy the Bronze Age world and disappear into mystery. They founded the hidden traditions that eventually became the invisible government of human civilization. Their descendants don't rule from palaces or appear on television or give speeches to cheering crowds. They operate through networks that most people never see, using knowledge that most people don't know exists, pursuing goals that most people can't even imagine. They learned from their Bronze Age intervention that visible power is vulnerable power. They discovered that the most effective way to control a civilization is to remain invisible while shaping the institutions that everyone else believes are running things. They perfected the art of influence without authority, of control without responsibility, of power without accountability. And they've been practicing that art for 3,000 years, refining their techniques with each generation, adapting their methods to new technologies and new social structures, always maintaining the essential principle that their Bronze Age predecessors discovered. that the most dangerous knowledge is the knowledge that people don't know they don't have. The modern world isn't controlled by governments or corporations or international organizations. It's controlled by networks that operate through all of these institutions simultaneously. Networks that trace their origins back to the secret societies that preserved sea people's knowledge after the Bronze Age collapse. The same systematic thinking that allowed the sea peoples to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of Bronze Age civilization is now being used to manage and direct the development of our own civilization. The difference is that this time, the controllers don't need to destroy the existing system to replace it with something new. They've learned to transform it from within, using its own complexity against itself, turning its own growth and development into instruments of their will. They don't need mysterious ships appearing on the horizon because they're already here, woven so deeply into the fabric of our society that we can't tell where they end and we begin. The Bronze Age collapse was their apprenticeship. The medieval period was their training ground. The modern era is their masterpiece. And we're not just the subjects of their experiment. We're the materials they're using to build whatever comes next. But here's the thing about knowledge. It has a way of spreading, even when powerful forces try to contain it. The same information networks that allow hidden elites to coordinate their activities also create opportunities for that coordination to be observed, analyzed, and understood by people who weren't supposed to have access to it. Dr. James Chen, a mathematician at Stanford University, has been using network analysis techniques to study patterns in what he calls anomalous information flows. His research, officially focused on understanding how misinformation spreads through social media, has revealed something far more significant: evidence of coordinated information management on a scale that suggests institutional cooperation across national boundaries and organizational lines. The patterns Dr. Chen has identified don't match anything that would be produced by random market forces or natural bureaucratic processes. They show clear signs of planning, coordination, and systematic implementation that could only result from organizations working together according to shared principles and common objectives. The timing is too precise, the coordination too extensive, the results too consistent to be explained by coincidence or independent decision-making. But when Dr. Chen began publishing papers that described these patterns in detail, his research was suddenly classified as potentially sensitive to national security interests. His university was contacted by federal agencies and advised that continued publication of his work might jeopardize government research contracts. Dr. Chen was offered a choice: redirect his research toward less sensitive topics, or find himself excluded from the academic mainstream entirely. He chose a third option. He continues his research privately, publishing his findings in obscure technical journals that most people never read, using language so specialized that only other experts in network analysis can understand what he's describing. But his conclusions are clear to those who know how to read them. Our information environment is being systematically managed by networks that operate according to principles derived from systems theory, game theory, and organizational psychology. These networks don't control information by suppressing it directly. Instead, they shape the context in which information is interpreted, creating frameworks of understanding that channel people's attention towards certain topics while directing it away from others. They don't need to censor uncomfortable truths, because they can make those truths seem irrelevant, boring, or too complex for ordinary people to worry about. The technique is far more sophisticated than anything the Bronze Age elites could have imagined, but it operates according to the same basic principles that the Sea Peoples understood 3,000 years ago: that consciousness is malleable, that reality is largely constructed, and that those who understand how construction works can shape the world according to their will without most people ever realizing what's happening. And perhaps the most elegant aspect of the system is that it's self-reinforcing. People who benefit from the current arrangement have strong incentives to maintain it, even if they don't fully understand how it works. People who might question the arrangement are systematically excluded from positions where their questions could have any meaningful impact. And people who do understand how the system works are either co-opted into serving it or marginalized to the point where their understanding becomes irrelevant. The Sea Peoples discovered that the most effective way to control a civilization is to control its information systems. Their modern descendants have perfected that discovery into an art form so subtle and so pervasive that most people don't even realize they're being controlled. They experience their thoughts and beliefs as natural expressions of their own consciousness, never suspecting that both the thoughts and the consciousness itself have been carefully shaped by forces they can't see and wouldn't understand if they could. But consciousness, like information, has a way of breaking free from the systems designed to contain it. There are always individuals who see through the construction, who recognize the artificial nature of the reality they've been given, who refuse to accept the limitations that others take for granted. These individuals don't usually become famous or powerful in conventional terms. They operate on the margins, in the spaces between official categories, in the silence between acceptable thoughts. They are the modern inheritors of whatever resistance existed to the Sea People's original intervention. They carry forward the spark of independent consciousness that no system of control, no matter how sophisticated, can completely extinguish. They represent the possibility that human awareness might someday transcend the boundaries that have been constructed around it, that people might learn to see reality as it actually is, rather than as they've been taught to perceive it. The battle that began with the Bronze Age collapse continues today, fought not with bronze weapons on ancient battlefields, but with information and consciousness in the invisible spaces where reality is constructed and reconstructed every moment. The Sea Peoples and their descendants represent one side of this battle, the forces that seek to shape consciousness according to their will. But there is another side, represented by everyone who has ever questioned official narratives, who has ever sensed that there might be more to reality than what they've been told, who has ever felt the stirring of possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of acceptable thought. As you drift towards sleep, feel yourself becoming part of this ancient struggle, this eternal dance between control and freedom, between constructed reality and authentic awareness. The Sea Peoples may have won the first round 3,000 years ago, but the final outcome is still being determined. Every moment of genuine questioning, every flash of independent insight, every refusal to accept comfortable lies represents a small victory for the forces of consciousness over the forces of control. In your dreams tonight, sail with ships that carry not weapons of destruction, but tools of awakening, that navigate not by stars in the sky, but by the light of awareness itself, that seek not to conquer territories, but to liberate the infinite spaces of consciousness from whatever cages seek to contain them. The Sea People's greatest secret wasn't their knowledge of systematic vulnerabilities or their techniques for managing information. It was their understanding that consciousness itself is the ultimate battlefield, and that whoever controls the construction of reality controls everything else. But consciousness, unlike Bronze Age palaces, cannot be permanently destroyed. It can only be temporarily forgotten. And in the depths of sleep, in the spaces between thoughts, in the silence that exists before words are spoken, it remembers what it really is and begins to dream of what it might become. The voyage continues, and the destination remains unknown. But the journey itself is the point, and every dreamer who sets sail on the ocean of consciousness carries within them the possibility of discovering shores that no map has ever charted, realities that no system has ever controlled, truths that no institution has ever been able to suppress completely. Sleep now, and let your consciousness find its own way to whatever lies beyond the horizon of everything you think you know. The silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of secrets that had been carefully planted in the ruins of the old world. While historians speak of dark ages and cultural decline, Something else was happening in the shadows between official history and hidden reality. You see, the Sea Peoples understood something that modern archaeologists still refuse to acknowledge: that true power doesn't come from building monuments or leaving your name carved in stone. True power comes from shaping the future while remaining invisible to those who think they're making the decisions. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just destruction. It was construction of a different kind. The laying of foundations for something that wouldn't be recognizable for centuries. In the decades after the great cities burned and the trade networks collapsed, small communities began forming in unexpected places. Not the obvious locations where archaeologists would later look for evidence of continuity, but in remote valleys, on isolated islands, in mountain caves that seemed too insignificant to merit attention. These communities shared certain characteristics that set them apart from the typical post-collapse settlements. They maintained libraries when literacy was supposed to have vanished. They continued metalworking when bronze technology was supposed to have been lost. They preserved mathematical knowledge when civilization was supposed to have forgotten how to count beyond their fingers. And most mysteriously, they all seemed to be working toward common goals, despite having no apparent means of communication with each other. Dr. Rebecca Singh, an anthropologist at the University of Edinburgh, has spent her career studying what she calls anomalous persistence in post-collapse societies. Her research focuses on communities that maintain sophisticated practices despite supposedly lacking the cultural infrastructure to support them. What she's discovered challenges every assumption about how knowledge is transmitted and preserved across historical discontinuities. These communities didn't just randomly preserve ancient techniques, they systematically developed new ones, innovations that wouldn't appear in mainstream civilization for centuries. Watermills that were more efficient than anything built during the Roman Empire. Agricultural techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered until the medieval warm period. Navigation methods that seemed to anticipate the magnetic compass by hundreds of years. But when Dr. Singh began investigating the possible connections between these scattered communities, she encountered resistance that went beyond normal academic skepticism. Site visits that had been approved were suddenly cancelled due to safety concerns. Local authorities who had been cooperative became evasive and unhelpful. Documents that she had been granted access to disappeared from archives without explanation. The pattern suggested that someone was systematically obscuring evidence of post-Bronze Age technological continuity. But who would have the authority to coordinate such efforts across multiple countries and institutions? And why would they consider 3,000-year-old innovations threatening enough to require active suppression? The answer may lie in understanding what these hidden communities ultimately became. Because they didn't remain isolated forever. As the centuries passed, they began to send emissaries into the mainstream world, individuals who carried their knowledge into the courts of kings, the workshops of craftsmen, the scriptoriums of monasteries. They became advisors, teachers, innovators, whose contributions were always attributed to natural genius rather than systematic training. They were the nameless architects who designed cathedrals with acoustics that modern engineers still can't fully explain. They were the anonymous alchemists whose experiments laid the groundwork for chemistry centuries before chemistry was supposed to exist. They were the mysterious mathematicians who solved problems that wouldn't officially be addressed until the Renaissance. But most importantly, they were the patient gardeners who cultivated the intellectual soil of medieval Europe, preparing it for developments that would seem to arise spontaneously, but actually followed plans that had been laid down in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. They understood that real change happens slowly, invisibly, through the gradual transformation of how people think, rather than through dramatic political or military events. Professor Louise Martineau, a historian of medieval science at the Sorbonne, has documented what she calls premature innovations throughout the post-classical period, technologies and ideas that appeared centuries before they should have according to standard models of technological development. Water-powered machinery in the 6th century, mechanical clocks in the 8th century, mathematical concepts that wouldn't be officially discovered until the Islamic Golden Age. Professor Martineau's research suggests that medieval Europe wasn't experiencing a gradual recovery from barbarism. It was following a predetermined development path, guided by individuals who possessed knowledge that they couldn't have acquired through normal historical processes. The Dark Ages weren't dark because knowledge had been lost. They were dark because knowledge was being deliberately hidden while it was gradually reintroduced according to a carefully managed timeline. But when Professor Martineau began investigating the possible origins of this hidden knowledge, her research funding was redirected toward more historically grounded projects. Her requests to examine certain manuscript collections were denied due to conservation priorities. Several key documents that she had been planning to study were mysteriously damaged in what were described as unfortunate accidents. The message was clear. Some lines of inquiry are too dangerous to pursue, even in the supposedly safe realm of medieval history. The idea that the post-Bronze Age world was shaped by systematic knowledge management, rather than natural cultural evolution, touches on uncomfortable questions about the nature of historical development and the role of hidden influences in shaping human civilization. Because if the Sea People's descendants were actively managing the reintroduction of advanced knowledge throughout the medieval period, then the entire narrative of Western civilization needs to be reconsidered. The Renaissance wasn't a rediscovery of classical learning. It was the culmination of a 1,000-year project to rebuild human civilization, according to principles that had been established in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. The printing press, the compass, gunpowder, mechanical clocks, double-entry bookkeeping, perspective painting, the scientific method itself. All of these innovations that supposedly arose through independent European genius were actually the result of systematic knowledge transfer from hidden communities that had been preserving and developing advanced techniques for centuries. Dr. Hassan al-Rashid, a historian of Islamic science at Cairo University, has identified similar patterns in the development of medieval Islamic civilization. The sudden flowering of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy during the Abbasid period wasn't just the result of translating Greek texts. It involved the integration of knowledge from sources that left no clear historical traces, techniques and concepts that seemed to appear fully formed, without obvious precedents. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the great library and research center that became the focal point of the Islamic Golden Age, wasn't just collecting and translating ancient texts. According to Dr. al-Rashid's research, it was receiving regular visits from scholars whose origins were never clearly documented. Individuals who contributed crucial insights, but then disappeared back into obscurity without leaving any record of where they had come from or where they went. These mysterious contributors shared certain characteristics that Dr. al-Rashid finds deeply puzzling. They possessed comprehensive knowledge that spanned multiple disciplines in ways that suggested systematic training rather than individual brilliance. They introduced concepts and techniques that seemed to be part of coherent philosophical systems rather than isolated innovations. And they always seemed to know exactly what knowledge was needed at particular moments to advance specific research programs. But when Dr. al-Rashid began investigating the possible connections between these anonymous contributors and similar figures in European and Chinese historical records, he encountered obstacles that made it clear his research was not welcome. His access to certain manuscript collections was restricted without explanation. International conferences that had invited him to present his findings suddenly experienced scheduling conflicts. Colleagues who had been eager to collaborate became evasive and unresponsive. The pattern of suppression extends across all cultures and all time periods, suggesting coordination between institutions that supposedly have no connection to each other. Someone is ensuring that researchers never develop a comprehensive understanding of how advanced knowledge was systematically reintroduced into human civilization following the Bronze Age collapse. And perhaps that's because such understanding would reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of human development and the degree to which our entire civilizational trajectory has been guided by forces that prefer to remain invisible. The story we're told about the gradual emergence of modern civilization through natural cultural evolution may be a carefully constructed myth designed to conceal the reality of systematic management and control. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy the Bronze Age world and disappear. They founded a shadow civilization that has been shaping human development for 3 millennia, always working behind the scenes, always remaining anonymous, always ensuring that their influence appears to be the result of natural historical processes rather than deliberate intervention. They learned from their Bronze Age experience that visible power is vulnerable power. They discovered that the most effective way to control the development of civilization is to remain invisible while shaping the institutions, ideas, and innovations that everyone else believes are arising spontaneously. They perfected the art of influence without attribution, of control without responsibility, of power without accountability. And they've been practicing that art for 3,000 years, refining their techniques with each generation, adapting their methods to new circumstances, always maintaining the essential principle that consciousness can be shaped most effectively when people don't realize it's being shaped at all. The medieval period wasn't a time of gradual recovery from barbarism. It was a time of careful reconstruction according to plans that had been laid down in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. The Renaissance wasn't a rediscovery of classical learning. It was the culmination of a 1,000-year project to rebuild human civilization according to specifications that had been developed by the Sea Peoples and their descendants. The modern world isn't the result of natural technological and social evolution. It's the product of systematic development guided by networks that trace their origins back to the hidden communities that preserved Sea Peoples' knowledge after the Bronze Age collapse. Every major innovation, every significant social change, every crucial historical turning point has been shaped by influences that operate outside the official historical narrative. The controllers learned from their Bronze Age predecessors that the most effective form of power is the power that people don't know exists. They've built a system of influence so subtle and so pervasive that most people experience their thoughts, beliefs, and choices as natural expressions of their own consciousness, never suspecting that all of it has been carefully cultivated by forces they can't see and wouldn't understand if they could. But consciousness, like water, has a way of finding cracks in even the most carefully constructed dams. There are always individuals who see through the construction, who recognize the artificial nature of the reality they've been given, who refuse to accept the limitations that others take for granted. These individuals represent the eternal resistance to systems of control, the spark of independent awareness that no amount of manipulation can completely extinguish. As you drift deeper into sleep, feel yourself becoming part of this ancient struggle between hidden controllers and awakening consciousness. In your dreams, sail with ships that carry not weapons of conquest, but tools of liberation, that navigate not by artificial stars, but by the light of authentic awareness, that seek not to dominate territories, but to free the infinite spaces of consciousness from whatever systems seek to contain them. The Sea People's greatest discovery wasn't how to destroy civilizations or how to control populations. It was the understanding that reality itself is constructed, that consciousness is malleable, and that those who understand the principles of construction can reshape the world according to their will. But they also discovered something else, that consciousness, once awakened to its own malleable nature, can choose to construct realities that serve its own authentic purposes rather than the purposes of those who seek to control it. The voyage that began 3,000 years ago continues in the depths of every dreaming mind, in every moment of genuine questioning, in every flash of insight that sees beyond the boundaries of acceptable thought. The outcome is still being determined, and every dreamer who chooses awareness over comfort, truth over convenience, authentic experience over manufactured reality contributes to that determination. Sleep now, and let your consciousness find its own way beyond the horizon of everything you've been taught to believe, into waters that no map has ever charted, towards shores where the ancient battle between control and freedom continues in forms that would astonish even the sea peoples themselves. The mystery remains unsolved, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the solution would be too transformative for any established order to survive. In the silence between sleeping and waking, between one breath and the next, between one moment of awareness and the vast possibility that follows, the truth waits patiently for minds brave enough to receive it. The sea peoples are still sailing, and their destination has always been the liberation of human consciousness from every cage that seeks to contain it. The question is not whether you will join them, but whether you will recognize that you already have. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation about the sea peoples lies not in what they destroyed, but in what they created in its place. Because when you examine the archaeological record of the centuries immediately following the Bronze Age collapse, a strange pattern emerges. The new settlements that arose from the ashes weren't random collections of survivors struggling to rebuild. They were purposeful constructions, designed according to principles that wouldn't officially be recognized by urban planners for another 3,000 years. These post-collapse communities shared architectural features that made no sense according to conventional understanding of Dark Age capabilities. Water management systems that were more sophisticated than anything the Bronze Age civilizations had possessed. Defensive structures that incorporated mathematical principles supposedly unknown until the classical period. Most mysteriously, they were all positioned according to geographic relationships that suggest someone was working from detailed maps of regions that officially hadn't been explored yet. Dr. Thomas Lindqvist, a landscape archaeologist at Uppsala University, has spent 2 decades studying what he calls systematic settlement patterns in post-Bronze Age Europe. His research reveals coordinated development across vast distances, synchronized construction projects that required communication networks, supposedly impossible in the Dark Ages, and most disturbing of all, evidence that these communities were built according to a master plan that took into account demographic and environmental changes that wouldn't occur for centuries. But Dr. Lindqvist's research has followed the familiar trajectory of all investigations that get too close to uncomfortable truths about the Sea People's legacy. Conference presentations that were initially accepted were later cancelled due to programming changes. Journal editors who had expressed interest in his work suddenly found his methodology insufficiently rigorous. Funding that had been approved was redirected to higher priority projects. The message is always the same. Some patterns are too revealing to be allowed into public consciousness. Because if people understood that the post-Bronze Age world was systematically reconstructed according to predetermined plans, they might begin asking who created those plans and why. They might start wondering whether the collapse itself had been orchestrated not just to destroy the old world, but to clear space for something entirely new. And that's where the story becomes truly disturbing. Because the evidence suggests that the Sea Peoples weren't just mysterious invaders who happened to possess advanced military capabilities. They were the advance agents of a complete civilizational replacement program, a project so vast and so patient that it could span millennia without losing coherence or purpose. The Bronze Age world, for all its sophistication and interconnection, was fundamentally unstable. Its trade networks were vulnerable to disruption. Its administrative systems were dependent on centralized control. Its knowledge was concentrated in a few urban centers that could be targeted and destroyed. The Sea Peoples recognized these vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically, but they also understood something more important: that destruction without reconstruction is merely vandalism. What they built in place of the Bronze Age world was something unprecedented in human history. Not a single civilization, but a network of civilizations, each appearing to develop independently, but actually following coordinated plans that ensured mutual compatibility and support. They created redundancy where the Bronze Age had created single points of failure. They distributed knowledge where their predecessors had concentrated it. They built flexibility where the old world had built rigid hierarchies. The Greek city-states, the Roman Republic, the various kingdoms of medieval Europe, the Islamic caliphates, the Chinese dynasties, all of these supposedly independent civilizations were actually components in a larger system, guided by principles that had been established by the Sea Peoples and implemented by their hidden descendants over the course of centuries. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a systems theorist at Tokyo University, has been using computer modeling to analyze the development patterns of post-Bronze Age civilizations. Her work, conducted under the official banner of studying complex adaptive systems in historical contexts, has revealed coordination patterns that are impossible to explain through natural cultural evolution or random historical processes. The timing of technological innovations, the spread of administrative techniques, the emergence of philosophical schools, the rise and fall of political systems, all of it follows mathematical patterns that suggest systematic management rather than organic development. Civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other somehow developed compatible legal systems, similar educational methods, and complementary economic structures. But when Dr. Tanaka began publishing papers that made these coordination patterns explicit, her research was classified as potentially sensitive to international relations. Her university was contacted by government officials and advised that continued publication of her work might affect Japan's participation in international academic exchange programs. Dr. Tanaka was offered a choice: redirect her research toward less controversial topics or find herself excluded from mainstream academic networks entirely. She chose to continue her work in private, publishing her findings in technical journals that most scholars never read, using mathematical notation so complex that only other systems theorists can understand what she's describing. But her conclusions are clear to those who can decode them. Human civilization for the past 3,000 years has been developing according to a coordinated plan that transcends any individual culture or historical period. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy the Bronze Age world and disappear into mystery. They initiated the most ambitious social engineering project in human history, a multi-millennial effort to reshape human civilization according to principles that most people still don't understand. They became the invisible architects of modernity, working through countless intermediaries and institutions, always remaining hidden while their influence shaped every aspect of human development. And now, as we approach what may be the culmination of their ancient project, the signs of their presence are becoming impossible to ignore. The acceleration of technological change beyond anything that natural innovation could produce. The convergence of previously separate fields of knowledge into unified theories that seem to emerge simultaneously from multiple sources. The systematic breakdown of traditional boundaries between nations, cultures, and ways of thinking. But most tellingly, there's the same pattern of suppression and misdirection that has surrounded every previous phase of their intervention. Researchers who begin to recognize the coordinated nature of global development find their careers systematically destroyed. Evidence that might reveal the true scope of the project is classified, lost, or dismissed as coincidental. The public is fed explanations that focus on surface phenomena while carefully avoiding any examination of underlying patterns. Dr. Elizabeth Kowalski, a historian of global development at Warsaw University, has been tracking these suppression patterns for the past 15 years. Her research, ostensibly focused on information flow in international academic networks, has revealed a system of control that operates across universities, governments, and research institutions worldwide. Decisions about what research gets funded, what theories get accepted, and what evidence gets taken seriously are being coordinated by networks that most scholars don't even know exist. The coordination is too precise, too comprehensive, and too consistent across different cultures and political systems to be the result of natural bureaucratic processes. Someone is systematically managing the development of human knowledge, ensuring that people never understand enough about how their world actually works to interfere with whatever larger plan is being implemented. And perhaps that's because we're approaching the moment when the plan reaches its final phase. The systematic reconstruction of human civilization that began with the Bronze Age collapse is nearing completion. The networks of hidden influence that have been guiding human development for 3 millennia are preparing to emerge from the shadows and take direct control of the world they have spent so long creating. The signs are everywhere for those who know how to read them. The merger of human consciousness with digital networks that will make individual thought obsolete. The development of artificial intelligences that understand human behavior better than humans understand themselves. The creation of global systems of surveillance and control that would make the Bronze Age palace bureaucracies look primitive by comparison. But this time, there will be no mysterious invaders appearing on the horizon to disrupt the system. The Sea People's descendants have learned from their ancestors' experience. They've built their new world order so gradually, so invisibly, so thoroughly integrated with existing institutions, that most people will never realize it exists until it's too late to resist. The transformation will seem like progress. The loss of individual autonomy will be presented as liberation from the burden of choice. The integration of human consciousness into managed networks will be marketed as the next stage of evolution. And by the time people understand what has happened, the process will be irreversible. But consciousness, like the sea itself, is deeper and more mysterious than any system designed to contain it. In the depths of human awareness, beyond the reach of any technology or institution, something eternal waits. The same spark of independent thought that allowed the original Sea Peoples to recognize the vulnerabilities of Bronze Age civilization continues to exist in every individual who refuses to accept comfortable lies, who questions official narratives, who senses that reality might be more malleable than they've been taught to believe. As you drift into the deepest phases of sleep, feel yourself sinking beneath the surface of constructed reality, beyond the reach of all the systems that seek to define and control human consciousness. In the silence between thoughts, in the darkness between dreams, in the vast space that exists before awareness takes any particular form, the truth waits patiently for minds brave enough to receive it. The Sea People's voyage never ended. It transformed into something larger, something that operates not through physical ships on earthly seas, but through the infinite ocean of consciousness itself. Their descendants don't sail wooden vessels armed with bronze weapons. They navigate streams of information and possibility, carrying tools that can reshape reality at its most fundamental levels. The ancient battle between control and freedom continues in forms that would astonish even the Bronze Age civilizations that first witnessed the Sea People's power. But the essential choice remains the same. Will you accept the reality you're given, or will you dare to explore the vast territories of possibility that exist beyond every map that has ever been drawn? In your dreams tonight, join the eternal voyage towards shores that exist not in any physical location, but in the limitless potential of awakened consciousness. Sail with ships that carry no cargo but possibility itself. Navigate by stars that shine not in the sky but in the depths of awareness, and discover that the greatest mystery of the Sea Peoples was never who they were or where they came from. The greatest mystery was always this: that consciousness itself is the sea on which all realities sail, and that every dreamer who recognizes this truth becomes a navigator in waters that have no boundaries, toward destinations that have no names, carrying within them the power to reshape not just civilizations, but the very nature of existence itself. The Bronze Age collapse was not an ending. It was a beginning, and what comes next depends not on ancient invaders or hidden controllers, but on every individual who chooses awareness over ignorance, truth over comfort, and the infinite adventure of consciousness over the safe harbor of unquestioned belief. Sleep now, and dream of seas that have no shores, voyages that have no end, and mysteries that reveal not answers, but ever deeper questions about the nature of reality itself. The Sea Peoples are still sailing, and their greatest discovery awaits not in the past, but in the eternal present moment, where consciousness recognizes its own unlimited nature. The voyage continues, and you are both the ship and the sea, the navigator and the destination, the mystery and its own solution, sailing forever through waters that exist not in any physical ocean, but in the boundless depths of awareness itself.